Hello everybody, I'm Nora Burrows. We're gonna make some wonky trees today. This is a little baby quilt that I made a while back, and as you can see, each one of these trees is kind of a different shape. Like some of them are short and stumpy, some of them are, tall and thin. They all have different sized trunks. I've picked out some bright fabrics here. I always find these trees to be more fun when the patterns are wild and crazy. Polka dots, stripes, bright colors. Let's go ahead and we're gonna cut out a couple small triangles. They don't even have to be, perfectly symmetrical. They can be wonky, they can be thick, they can be thin, but just go ahead and cut out a couple small triangles to start. Next up, let's pick out a background to go with each one of these. In the green with this polka dot. And as you notice, I'm using, some of the fabrics that were on the body of the tree I'm using for a background. So it's a little bit of theme and variation there, which I think is cool. How about these two together? That's kind of neat. So we'll do those ones. Okay, so I think that's it. We're gonna put these aside for a second and we're gonna cut out some trunks. Now I'm not even gonna use my rotary cutter and ruler to cut out my trunks. I'm just gonna use my fabric scissors. I've cut out my trunks and some of them aren't even, parallel straight up and down. This one is kind of tilted, which is kind of cool. I think that's really neat. This one gets smaller as it gets towards the top. And then some of these other ones, that I had cut up and down, you could actually turn and make the tree sideways, which I think I like that better. So some of these I'll probably turn sideways to be the trunk. Now you want to match up your trunks with your trees. You can start to see how different all of these trees are looking. Like this tree is so much different than this one just by the trunk being a different shape. Now, for each of your trunks, you're going to cut a strip of background fabric. Let me show you. I've just placed the body of my tree above my fabric and the trunk right on top of the fabric. I want to cut my strip to be a little bit wider than the trunk. Then you want to cut your background fabric to be long enough that it extends with the ruler. So you wouldn't want to cut it, like right here, because you would be losing a chunk here for our next steps. This is probably fine on this side. And then down on this side, I would want to be, at least here, but give myself maybe even a little bit more wiggle room. So I'm going to cut it right about here. And then I'm going to cut this exactly in half. Now I'm going to sew the trunk to these pieces. So I'll put right sides together and sew with a 1/4 inch right down here and open it up. Now we'll do the same to the other side. Put these right sides together, sew 1/4 inch and open it up. We now have our trunk and background. Let's cut a straight line across one side. That's looking pretty good. And then we have the top of our tree here. So next, what we're gonna do is sew the top of our tree to the piece we just created down here. So we'll put right sides together, line it up right in the middle, and sew 1/4 inch. This is looking pretty good so far. So now we're gonna take our ruler and we are gonna cut a line right along the right edge of our tree to cut off a little bit of this background. And this is a nice little scrap we can use in another project. You could even make this a tree trunk for a different tree. Maybe we'll do that. And then we're gonna do the same to the other side. I need to cut 2 strips of fabric for each side. You wanna make sure that you cut your strips wide enough so that when you're squaring off your block, you don't have any empty space up here. So I'm gonna cut mine about 3.5 inches, which would give me plenty of room, I think. Here's my strip. And I wanna make sure I leave a little bit of a tail at the top to have room to square this off. And enough room at the bottom so that this line can continue this way. You can see that if you sew this tip to tip. When you square off your block, you'll be missing a section down here. So you need to sew this kind of right in the middle. Right sides together, 1/4 inch. Next, we're gonna cut a line on the diagonal here, just following along the diagonal that already exists, and trim this top part off. And now we need a strip for here. This one is not gonna be long enough. I think it will. Let's turn it around. Yeah, I think that'll work okay. If you follow the lines, it should be fine. Let's try it. And this is just the strip that was left over from this side. Let's square this up, and then we're gonna add a strip along the bottom. I'm gonna cut this about 1.5 inches above the tip of the tree. And then let's cut each side. And these are really great pieces to keep and save and use. Now let's straighten this up right along the bottom of the trunk. Last thing, we'll add a strip along the bottom. I have this left over from when we put our background onto the sides of the trunk. So let me just trim this here. We'll sew these right sides together and flip. Here's our first one done. I think that's a great one. That's really fun. Let's do another one, a little faster this time. Let's do this one next, but instead of this trunk that I had cut out, let's use some of this fabric from the background of our last one. That'll be cute. First thing, we need to cut a strip for the background behind the trunk. Here's my strip. I'm gonna cut it in half. Attach the left side and then attach the right side. Now we're gonna cut a straight line along the top side of our trunk. And sew the body of our tree to our trunk. Let's cut our diagonal line on the left. And I'm gonna cut a strip of fabric about the same size. It probably doesn't need to be 3.5 inches. This one probably can be closer to 3. So I'll cut a piece of fabric to put on the left-hand side there. I've cut my strip. I'm gonna sew it with enough room on the bottom to create my straight line, right sides together. We'll cut our straight line down the right-hand side here. Just lining the ruler up against the edge of the tree. And let's see if this piece is big enough. I might have to cut another one. I think it'll be okay. We'll put it right there. I just went ahead and squared this up. Let's attach a piece to the bottom. Here's another piece down here. Let's sew that on. I have to say with this one, the trunk is a little big for the tree. Let's maybe try cutting it down a bit. We'll lose a little bit in the seam allowance, so it will be a little bit smaller, but I think it needs to be even smaller than that. Let's make it a tiny trunk for a tiny tree. Maybe even smaller. That's a little better. I'll sew these right sides together and flip it open. Let's trim this up and then we'll be done with this block. I wish I had put the orange trunk on a different tree. Let me show you. Like, I think that it probably would have gone better on like this one with the orange trunk, but it's fine. I mean, it blends a little bit with the background since there's orange in the background, but that's okay. So I made a couple more. These are the first ones that we did. We made this one first. And then this one is really fun. I love the trunk on this one. That came out really cool. So these are really fun, and the more you have, with the more fabrics and everything, the cooler I think that the quilt is. Now, none of these are the same you know, width or height. And what I did on the other quilt is I put a border around each block, and the borders are all different sizes. And in fact, I didn't even center all the borders. You can see that this border on this side is a little wider than this one. I did that on purpose. I thought it was kind of cool. But it ends up so that if you put borders on each of these, if you decide what you want your finished block to be, then you know how big of a border to put on. You have to take into account 1/2 inch, right? Seam allowance on one side and the other makes 1/2 inch. So then you would have your full size block. All of your blocks would end up being the same size. So for example, the border here would be wider than the border here for these two blocks to end up being the same size. But once your blocks are all the same size, you can attach them. After the border, I use some sashing here, which I think is kind of fun. But you can do all kinds of things with these blocks. You could even make a placemat or a little coaster or mug rug. You can make a bag. But I think the full quilt is pretty dramatic and fun. So thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.